What is up, my dashing dudes? I am the Hans TV. Are you ready to learn what happens when your roommate starts stealing stuff from you? Let's find out about that in today's episode of r/Nuclear Revenge. Our first story for the day comes from Tinder Guy 11. Evil stepmother takes revenge on my entire family. To be honest, I have no idea what subcategory to write this story in, because it has a bit of everything. Entitled parents, entitled people, nuclear revenge, and fair warning, this story stretches out over a period of more than a decade, so it's gonna be a long one. By far, not the first story I have posted, but due to how personal this story is to me, I created this new account just to post this one. So, first some backstory. I came from your average nuclear family. I had a mom and a dad who hated each other and seemed to spend their whole marriage talking about divorce. An older sister whom I did not get along with, but as time went on, would not only become my best friend, but also kind of my hero. And me, the youngest, 14 years old when this all started. Very relevant to the story. My dad, until losing his job only a few months ago, worked overseas most of my life and was only home 5 months of the year. So, our tale begins with my mother succumbing to her long battle with cancer. She had been hospitalized for quite some time, and I will admit, those last few months, I had given up completely. I had hardly gone to see her. I just could not bring myself to see her rotting away in that hospital bed. My dad hadn't been much better than me, and the hero of the story had been my sister, the one who had never gotten along with my mother, who held her hand until the very end. None of this is vital to the story, but it was the one point where my sister not only won my respect, but also became the one person whom I would grow to trust more than any other. My dad, not so much. In fact, his life had hardly changed at all, and my mom's ashes had hardly been released, and he was overseas again, leaving me and my sister behind. Also worth mentioning that, at this time, my sister was no longer living at home, but living with her fiancé. He later cheated on her. She broke the engagement, and he will therefore not feature in this story. So, all the pieces are set in place. My mom's dead, my dad's overseas, and my sister's living elsewhere, leaving me, a 14-year-old kid, living alone in what, until recently, was our family home. Soon after, I got a tenant to take one of the rooms, and that rent money paid for all my living expenses. Now, as I mentioned, my dad was out of the country only 7 months of the year, which meant he was home for 5 of them, or so you'd expect. The truth is, he wasn't. My dad was a skirt chaser, and even in those 5 months, I hardly ever saw him, as he'd be out staying with whatever he was hooking up with at the time. I could write about 1,000 more stories about the women he dated in that time, but as none of them have relevance to this story, I'm skipping forward 4 years and the introduction to Evil Stepmother. It is worth mentioning that when she and my dad started dating, he was actually already engaged to someone else, who kinda just disappeared from the story as if she was never in his life to begin with. Evil Stepmother was the wife of a deceased politician. I've never been able to figure out how much exactly he had left her, but my estimate is somewhere between 15 and 20 million, although neither my sister or I had any interest in money. Her financial status wasn't something of a relief, as my dad was pretty well off himself, so at the very least, we knew she wasn't another gold digger. So actually, when I first met her, she was lovely, polite, a good sense of humor, overall just a nice person to be around, and I was truly happy that my dad had finally found somebody who could make him happy. Skip forward another year, my sister was now engaged to a new guy, and was starting to plan her wedding. My sister, being the angel that she is, even with a multi-millionaire father, never asked him to contribute a single penny to the wedding. What did she ask him? For him and Evil Stepmother to attend. He was her dad after all. Please note, even though I'm calling her Evil Stepmother, she wasn't officially our stepmother yet at this point. She had given the date to Evil Stepmother, who kinda brushed it off and said they would try to attend, but they couldn't make any promises, because it might interfere with their holiday plans. My sister was understandably distraught and ultimately just called off the wedding and would end up taking their vows in front of a judge. So, a few weeks after Evil Stepmother had broken my sister's heart, she and my dad were traveling to God knows where, and my sister and I were at the movies. We both get the same text from Evil Stepmother. It went something like this: "Hello, I wanted you to be the first to know that father has asked me to become his wife, and I have accepted." I forget what the rest said. Cut forward to the day that my sister's wedding would have taken place, and we both get an invite to evil stepmother's house. My dad had long since moved in with her. I had a bad feeling about this, but thought to myself that no one can possibly be so unnecessarily cruel. But if people weren't, then I would not be writing this story. So, you guessed it. Evil stepmother had stolen my sister's wedding date and had married our dad that morning. The invite we had received was to their wedding reception. There's going to be a massive time jump now, but before I do, I just want to emphasize some of the highlights of my dad and evil stepmother's first marriage. Yes, you read that right. These included a house rule which strictly forbid me or my sister ever mentioning our deceased mother, me making the grave sin of turning 21. Please note, at no point did I ask my father to cut their vacation short to celebrate this with me, but he decided to come home to surprise me and come home a day earlier to do so. The next 5 years, and I'm not making that up, every single time evil stepmother saw me, she would berate me for how my birthday screwed up their vacation. Her and my dad showing up at the family house while I was at work, taking the family dogs and giving them away without so much as consulting me. To top it all off, she would constantly try and play my sister and me up against each other, always cornering one of us and telling us what a waste of space the other was. So skip forward about another year. I had now been the landlord of the family house for about 7 years. I was now renting out to several tenants and using that money to rent the house from my dad. The rest I used to upkeep the place as well as I possibly could. Basically, even though his name is still on the deed, it was pretty much accepted that the house was now mine and would officially become mine when my dad passes. The place was beyond sentimental to me. And then, one afternoon, he shows up with a car full of things declaring that he has left evil stepmother and was moving back in with me. Oh joy. Following this, it took less than a month for all my tenants to break their contracts and move out. Yes, he really was that difficult to live with. The month ended and he went back overseas, leaving me with an empty house and somehow still expecting me to pay him for that month's rent. Sorry, Dad, you kinda screwed that up for yourself. He returned 6 weeks later and fell back into his old patterns, never coming home, hooking up with any women that looked at him, and then, somehow, getting back together with the fiancée he had left for evil stepmother. His divorce from evil stepmother had already been finalized by this point, and then, almost as if I was 18 years old again, he once again left that same fiancée for evil stepmother. At some point, they got remarried. I honestly don't remember when. So, let's get to the main part of this story. Yes, I haven't even touched it yet. A secret about my dad, I love him dearly, but he is a freaking bastard. I would learn this the hard way, as I would become a pawn in his numerous affairs. He went so far as to send some of these women to stay in the family house with me and then invite me over to have dinner with him and evil stepmother, forcing me to fake smile while the woman he was cheating with was literally hiding at my house. This went on for years. Both I and my sister knew about it. Both of us had begged him to stop, and he just did not give two hecks. Wow, it's taking a lot out of me to not use curse words as I relive this period. Also during this period, my sister had given birth to a beautiful baby girl. Even though my dad and evil stepmother had already been having marital problems at that time, again, he had shown up with her to the hospital and introduced her as grandma. In the years that followed, this gorgeous little one would actually bring my sister and evil stepmother quite close together, which makes this all the more tragic. Flash forward several more years. I am now 30 and going through a very tough time in my life. I had lost my own fiance, in part due to my family shunning both of us and ultimately forcing me to choose between them and her. This basically happened every single time I got a girlfriend. My business had hit a streak of insanely bad luck and was hanging on by a thread. I had lost all of my savings trying to save my beautiful dog from a rare blood disease. She died a month later anyway. I had been falsely accused of rape. Basically, I was closer to suicide than I ever imagined possible. And to top that all off, my dad again left evil stepmother and once more moved back in with me. To make matters even worse, he wasn't doing so alone. No, he brought with him his Asian mistress, a lady that could not speak a word of English, and they were literally communicating with each other via Google Translate. The whole situation was pretty messed up. Just to keep the timeline straight, he had left her before going back to work overseas, and had warned me beforehand that he would be moving back in with me upon his return. At no point had he mentioned his Asian mistress. Also, slightly relevant, the day he came back was the 24th of December. At this time, evil stepmother was on the verge of her own mental breakdown and was calling my sister day and night, trying to learn why my dad had left her. This went on for the entire time that my dad was overseas and continued when he came back. My sister was calling me in tears, saying she could not keep this secret anymore. She had grown fond of evil stepmother and knew the only way to release her was to tell her about the affairs. There had been 8 that we know of. I, on the other hand, had never grown to like evil stepmother, but even I had always been disgusted by our father's behavior and never saw any justification in what he had been doing to her. Ultimately, I told my sister to just tell her. That would be the biggest mistake of my life. You see, learning of my dad's betrayal had given evil stepmother a new purpose in life. She wasn't only going to get revenge on my dad, she was going to get revenge on everyone that was involved. Her first mission was finding out who the woman was that was currently staying with him. To find out, she turned to me. Now, side note here. I had been so angry at my dad for this whole situation that I hadn't even been back to my house since he had moved back in. I had spent about 3 days, including Christmas, just driving around aimlessly. I had slept in my car for those nights. I was done being his accomplice. Therefore, when evil stepmother asked me who the woman was, I happily told her. There was just one problem with this. My dad had foreseen me turning on him and given me the wrong information. Therefore, in the eyes of evil stepmother, I had purposely sent her a wild goose chase. Following this, my dad had sent me a message that I was no longer his son. The woman had actually been a masseuse at a massage parlor that both my dad and evil stepmother had often frequented, less than a kilometer away from their home. To this day, I don't know how evil stepmother found this out, but she showed up at the massage parlor and started screaming and threatening to sue. She also started following my dad's mistress around. What happened next, she refuses to admit was her doing. But a few days later, someone sent naked photos of my dad's mistress to her boss, and she was subsequently fired. My dad, in the meantime, had grown bored with her as well, and had started to rebuild his marriage with evil stepmother. This was unbeknownst to both me and my sister, and made even less sense when their second divorce finalized. My dad's mistress, around this time, also completely vanished off the face of the earth. Did I mention that evil stepmother liked to brag about the mob connections she had left from her deceased husband's time in politics and had openly told us how they could make people just completely disappear? Cut forward a few months later. I hadn't seen my dad in months and still had no idea that he and evil stepmother had gotten back together. I found this out when his Facebook relationship status changed to married to evil stepmother, followed by their wedding pictures. This was kind of a shock to me, but the biggest one was still to come. I was still in financial difficulty following my recent streak of bad luck, and then I get a text. I forget what the exact wording was, but it basically came down to the fact that evil stepmother no longer felt comfortable living in their old place, knowing that he had met his mistress so close to there. So, he was taking back the family home, and I was going to have to evict all my tenants and move out myself. At that point, I had been living in that house for 19 years, and had been the acting landlord for 16 of those. To add fuel to the fire, I also learned that evil stepmother was having the old house demolished and building a new place on top of it. I was shattered. That place had meant more to me than anything else in this world, and she was coming in with bulldozers to destroy it. To make up for my sudden eviction, they had, however, taken the liberty of already finding me a new place to live that they knew would be in my budget. They took me there a few days later. This place was terrifying. It was the kind of place where you'd get shot in the face if you left home after dark. To make matters worse, they were right. It was literally the only place I could afford at that point on such a short notice. Dad of the Year and evil stepmother had left me to pack up the entire house, including everything left from my mother. The shoebox I was moving to obviously didn't have space for any of these things, so most of it ended up on the sidewalk. To evil stepmother, this had to have been like a mini O, as she had always had an unnatural hate towards my deceased mother, whom she had never met, and had died before she met my father. She would go so far as to destroy every single thing that held any memory of my mother, even cutting down our family tree and quite literally turning it into firewood. Taking my mother's wedding ring that had been left to my sister to hold for safekeeping, only to quite literally throw it away and deny ever having it. That was her revenge on me. My sister, she had other plans for. You see, once my sister had exposed my father's affair to her, she had wasted no time in revealing to him that my sister had sold him out. My dad, being the self-entitled person that he is, still was unable to see that he had been in the wrong here and basically had not spoken to my sister since. He had not only stopped speaking to her, but also stopped talking to his granddaughter. Both him and evil stepmother had been quite active in her life for the first few years, and now both had written her off completely. As I write this, 2 years after my sister had exposed my dad, he has not spoken to or even asked about his granddaughter once. I had confronted him about it on several occasions, but he kinda just shrugged me off and told me that I have not once taken into account how hard these last 2 years have been on him. It also later turned out that evil stepmother was monitoring his phone, and I'm pretty sure she had been deleting any messages that my sister had tried sending to him. About this all being hard on him, he was right. You see, even though my dad may have brought this all upon himself, I do truly feel sorry for him. Evil stepmother had taken away from all of us what she deemed most important to us. With me, it was my house and all my memories. With my sister, it was her relationship with her father, and with my father, it was his freedom. She had taken away all forms of privacy and freedom he had left. She had taken control of his bank accounts, taken to monitoring his incoming messages, deleted all his friends from his Facebook account, and lost him his job. The new house they built even had an open bathroom that you could literally not pee in private. It was disturbing and honestly very hard to witness. This story doesn't really have an ending. My sister has finally stopped trying to make up with my dad. The few times I have seen him have been under strict supervision from evil stepmother, and that usually ends with her fighting me and telling me what a stain I am on his life. Although I never saw my dad as any kind of saint, he was always my dad and I always loved him. Still do. But the man he is now is no longer a man. He is a prisoner. Evil stepmother has turned him into a real-life version of Theon Greyjoy, and for the life he is living now, I feel nothing but sadness. Update. Thanks a million for all the comments, supportive and otherwise. For those saying this is fake and that it's illegal for a 14-year-old to be renting out rooms, yes, you would be right. But funny thing about the law, people actually have to know a crime is being committed for it to become a legal issue. The tenants were getting pretty sweet deals, and it would have been against their own self-interest reporting the situation. The ones who said I was smooching off my dad, nopes. I never took a cent from him after I turned 18. In fact, I stopped needing him to provide anything after I got the tenants, and I was paying a lot of rent to live there. Granted, I could not afford to rent the entire house by myself, which is where the tenants came in quite handy and were why I couldn't afford to pay the full amount when they suddenly left. And then, for those saying I should write off my father, you're probably right. In fact, I know you're right. But at the moment, I'm happily living elsewhere and he is happily traveling around the world with evil stepmother. Our current relationship is the occasional text message and maybe a visit when he happens to be in the country. Frankly, they just don't really have that great an impact on my life anymore, and I'm not the kind to make dramatic gestures and telling people I never want to see them again. I just feel too bad afterward. And final one, for those asking why I'm not trying to get even with evil stepmother, back when I was 20/21, I acted out a nuclear revenge scenario on somebody that had wronged me. Maybe I'll write a story one day. The thing was, I thought I would feel greatly afterwards, and the truth was, I didn't. It's been more than 10 years, and I still feel guilty about how far I went, and the sad truth is, nothing was really achieved. I still hate the guy, just as much as I did back then, but still feel that by doing that. I actually became the villain and made him the victim, and I have no intention of doing anything like that again. Our next story comes from Hanako Ikazawi. 5 years of child abuse, a lifetime of hell on earth. Not my story, but a very close friend of mine who told me this. He was sexually abused by his stepfather ever since he was 6, and was violated around his 8th year. His biological father died of a work-related accident, and his mother married his stepfather that she knew from her hometown a few years after. That fatherly figure soon turned out to be an abusive monster that was oh so eager to put his hand on anything that moves. His mother didn't know of the sexual abuse that he was going through because the son was threatened by death of his mother and him if he says anything. He was in an ever worse situation after getting bullied and abused. He was completely suicidal. He was debating on just jumping in front of a semi and ending it all multiple times, but his mother was the only reason he didn't want to do it, and kept pushing on through it all. He started slowly making a few friends that helped him cope a little. On his 10th, he was violently molested and was left limping after his father went all out on him. He was forced to go to school the day after and was limping from the pain. Unable to sit at all, unable to move, but he endured it and shrugged it off as an accident so that no one finds out what happens. He saw what the man can do. He doesn't want his mother hurt or worse because he told on this monster. Even the bullies stopped making fun of him after seeing that he didn't care anymore about what they did to him. More uninterested in bullying an inanimate object than pity. A few older senior students, who were a mix of 16 and 18-year-olds, caught up to what happened and pulled him aside one day to ask what happened. They all sat down and talked. Although they knew what was happening, they merely asked to confirm what was going on. My friend, who told him not to spread it as if it means life and death to him, and especially his mother, let out all the information out of pure fear from about 5 or 6 behemoths towering around him, and years of abuse killing his self-esteem. The seniors were not amused. Not one bit. They were all hell-bent on making this man regret his life choices. And make him regret it, they did. They stalked him, cornered him, and afterwards went completely berserk on him, sodomized him with a multitude of tools, carved child rapist on his back, beat the bejesus out of his testicles to the point where he was quite literally pleading blood, and continued beating him up in the process, and afterwards just to really nail the point in. They didn't want him to die. They wanted him to live and suffer from it. He was rushed to the hospital with both his arms broken and multiple points, eye socket collapsed, and eye heavily damaged with no chance of repair. Both of his testicles were ruptured and are damaged beyond salvation. His anus was ripped to the size of a 22-centimeter ball, and he lost about 70% of his teeth. There was more, but it will take this whole post just to list all the damage they dealt. They caught him at the brink of death from all the bleeding and managed to keep him alive somehow. The next day, they told his mom of what happened, and what he did to him. She wasn't just filing for divorce, she took everything he had ever owned, all the money he had made, and afterwards had him put behind bars, with a little birdie that told every inmate inside of what he did. Last he heard of him was that he was being used quite literally as the prison soap dispenser while in the pen. He didn't die, but he was left with a gape that would make even that name jealous. Roaming the streets, shunned by everyone, and they still regularly tell people of who he is and what he did to publicly shame him for what he did, losing him any job possible and barred him from many establishments, and was regularly stoned, hissed at, and yelled at to go away like a stray dog. There was no mercy for him. 5 years of child abuse, a lifetime of hell on earth. My friend is now 26 years old, works in a decent place where he is beyond respected. His mother living with him, still single sadly, but he is now living a better life than what he had when he was a kid. He left the country where all of this happened with his mother and started working and studying, and now lives a more or less easier life, working as a vice principal in the nursery I work in despite his history. TLDR, the man physically and sexually abused my friend for 5 years straight, got more than he ever bargained for, got the beating of a lifetime, prison raked, publicly shamed, and hobo raised. Edit. By Izmir's Beard, a gold medal? Thanks for all the support. He is both happy and surprised by all the support this is getting. Edit 2. By Shore's Bones, 1,000 updudes. Edit 3. By the Nine Divine, a second gold medal? I'm running out of Skyrim jokes. Might have to ask Todd Howard for some more. Edit 4. By the Heart of Tamriel and the Doors of Sovngarde, a platinum medal? Stop. I yield. I am literally out of Skyrim quotes. Edit 5. But I give up. Julianos has failed me in wisdom. I darn ran out of Skyrim lines, but Mara sends her love to each and every one of you. Thanks for the silver. Our final story for the day comes from our husband. Thieving roommate gets what's coming to him. This got removed from Pro Revenge, but I thought you all might want to read it as it still makes me laugh, so nuclear it is. So, many years ago, while still a teen, I moved out of my parents' place to live across the street from my junior college. There were many students in the building, so I rented a room in a large basement 3-bedroom unit that was reserved for students at the school. I didn't really know anyone in the building, as it was on the other side of the city from where I grew up. At the time, there was one other roommate already living in the unit who we'll call Sean. To be kind, Sean was a short, fat putz. Older than myself by a few years, he was in some kind of simplified remedial program as he'd failed a couple of school years and mentioned how this was his last chance to make something of himself in his parents' eyes. Kinda dim, not too much going on in his life, but harmless. Or so I thought. Anyway, I was hoping to start things off on the right foot with him as he was to be my roommate, so I wanted to be friends. As I was moving in my stuff, he mentioned how he had no money for a moving van, so I offered to do a trip with my rented van to his parents if he needed any help moving some stuff of his. He happily accepted, so we drive to his parents, where I meet his mother and discover that he's from a somewhat affluent family, somewhat surprising considering he's too broke to hire a van, but whatever. A couple days later, I meet his nice girlfriend who lived up the hill from our apartment. Translation, she was extremely affluent. This girlfriend would dote on him, visiting him a lot at our place to the point where she would regularly hand deliver him delicious meals that had been prepared at her house. This will be important later. Anyway, it becomes apparent that this unassuming guy has a dishonest streak. While moving my stuff in, I'd mentioned that I had a spare waterbed. He immediately offered to buy it, so I moved it in myself and set it up with the agreement he'd pay me a friend price, around $200 for a $700 bed. Weeks pass, and he keeps giving me excuses about not paying whenever the subject comes up. He then started to randomly shift the narrative to a story about how his wealthy parents can pay for us to get a great condo in a new development just up the street. I remember wondering why his parents would make such an offer despite the fact that we just moved into our current apartment. The story didn't make sense. Nevertheless, he constantly tried to set up some visit with me and get me involved. I wasn't really interested in moving again at that point, so I never really pursued it. I learned later that this was not only a lie, but a typical ploy of his. Anyway, as I had just moved out of my old neighborhood, I hadn't opened up a new bank account. This was before internet banking, in this new part of town. So I was keeping my money, couple hundred, hidden in my room until I set up an account nearby. I was only loosely keeping track of this money and barely noticed how my money was going a little quickly until one day I go to get my last $40 and it's gone. Unfortunately, by this point, a third roommate had moved into our flat, a cool hippie dude from Maritimes. So, although I was convinced it was Sean that had robbed me, I wasn't 100% sure. To resolve things as amicably as possible, I decided to give him a chance to come clean. So, one night, I asked him point blank, fairly casually, if he'd taken my money, as I'd noticed a small amount was missing. I'll never forget his reaction. He immediately stiffened. His eyes glazed over and he blurted out, "I didn't take anything, it wasn't me," and just stared at me. I was shocked. He didn't just look guilty. His reaction has such a rehearsed quality. I could tell he'd been accused of similar things many times before. I tried my best to be calm, smile, and act as if I believed him. But inside, I was livid. I couldn't stop thinking about how this guy was trying to play me like a fool. I realized that although I knew it was him, I couldn't do anything about it as I had no proof. By this point, I felt sick to be living in the same space as this guy. I realized to get out of this situation and to deal with this jerk appropriately, I would have to lay a trap. To make sure he didn't suspect anything, the next day, I was all smiles, playing dumb. I explained loudly how, "I hope I don't lose my money again, I just got paid," and leave the apartment. Before I left, I made sure to leave my video camera filming my room. This was so long ago. It was a huge ass VHS tape camera that I had to hide on my bed under pillows and crap, but it still worked like a charm. I came back, replayed the tape, and 16 minutes in, I see that mother freaker going through my stuff. I tell you, I went cold as ice seeing Sean casually rifle through my things. My suspicions confirmed, I had to cool off with my friends across town over some beers. When I finally told them what was happening, they started pulling out bats, hockey sticks, and suggesting we go pay Sean a visit. As tempting as this was, I was now in college and didn't want to resort to messy violence, so instead, I plotted my revenge. The first thing I did was to make sure my cool hippie third roommate was in the loop. Not having had a lot of time to get to know him, I asked him his thoughts on retribution and if he agreed with an eye for an eye. Confident we were on the same page, I showed him the video. He freaks out over having a thief for a roommate, but I reassure him just to be cool, cause some things are going to happen to Sean real soon. Then I went to stay at my parents' house and waited until that Thursday. You see, Sean liked to talk a lot. Turns out, his rich parents had actually kicked him out of the house. The fact he'd actually found an apartment and gone back to school was a big success for him. On Thursday, he'd be out of the apartment as his parents were having a big congratulatory dinner for him at their place. So, I waited until I knew the dinner was over, then called his house to speak to his mother. Crazy thing is, both he and his sister pick up the phone at the same time. So while his sister goes to get his mom on the line, he's asking me loudly, "Why are you calling my mother?" repeatedly. His mother gets on, and while Sean's screaming at his mother to hang up, I calmly state, "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have reason to believe your son has stolen from me." Suddenly, there's dead silence. After almost a minute, she replies, "Take it up with Sean," and just hangs up. WTF? I don't know what reaction I expected, but it wasn't that. Anyway, now with just Sean on the line, I tell him the jig is up. I have him on tape and I want my money back. He replies, "You have nothing on me, freak you." At this point, I realize he's right. I'd really only filmed him rifling through my stuff. If I went to the police, the charges wouldn't stick, and there was a good chance he knew it. So, by this point, I tried very hard to be reasonable about things. But, as it was, his rich parents couldn't care less. I had no real proof to go to the police with, and worst of all, I still had a year-long lease to live with him. So freak that crap. I told him he'd better find another place to live and hung up the phone as it was time to go nuclear on his butt. Remember how I said the puts talk too much? Turns out he bragged about how he'd faked his credentials for the apartment, and landlord had never checked. So, first step was to drive with my folks to the landlord's office and tell them to evict him for theft immediately. When they start telling me crap like, "We'll have to take some time to review this matter," I immediately threaten a lawsuit over how they're liable as I can prove they never did the prescribed background check. My landlord goes pale and instantly promises everything I ask. I then take this moment to go downstairs for a minute, a statement witnessed by multiple people. I then go to Sean's room and take thousands of dollars of his expensive crap, stereo, TV, hockey jerseys, cologne, etc., and put it all outside on our enclosed hidden fire escape. I then go straight back upstairs, hello alibi, and leave with my folks. First chance I get, I call my friends with the bat. "Hey guys, who wants a new wardrobe and entertainment system?" I give them the instructions on how to find all Sean's stuff hidden in the unused back alley and chill with parents for the next 3 to 4 days. Upon returning to my apartment, I am greeted with awe by a highly entertained hippie roommate who gave me the play-by-play of what went down in my absence. Apparently, Sean returned from his dinner to an empty room devoid of any of his possessions, causing him to rampage through the apartment and curse my name. When Hippie innocently asked, "What's wrong, Sean?" he tells him that I stole all his stuff, but that his dad would get it back for him, as if, lol. The next morning, his alarm clock was the landlord walking into his room and showing it to a potential tenant while informing him that he was evicted immediately. He would later be dumped by his rich girlfriend who was buying his groceries. "You haven't changed, Sean, again with the lying and cheating," and disowned very publicly by his well-to-do dad. Indeed, his dad had come to the apartment only to tell Sean he was worthless and that, despite his crying and begging, he could not live back at the house. Desperate, Sean followed his dad outside and jumped on the hood of his car, pleading to go home. The dad had to drive to a nearby police station to have him removed. Last thing I heard, he was broke, dropped out of school, dumped by GF, and camping in a friend's backyard in a tent in Canada in November. TLDR, roommate who I was nice to betrays my trust by lying and stealing from me. So I basically destroyed his life, or at most 120 Canadian dollars. Edit. Addendum to show that I made the call that ruined Sean's homecoming dinner from my parents' place across town and not my shared apartment. Well, my dashing dudes, those were some long stories, but that's going to do it for today's episode of r/NuclearRevenge. I hope you liked the stories. If you did, they're going to be in the description as always. If you liked how I narrated this, go ahead and drop a sub, a like, and leave a comment with what you'd like me to read next. But with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.